Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are unpacking what has to be one of the absolute most fascinating scientific mysteries of Australia's ancient human history. We're talking about an epic story of survival, incredible technological adaptation, and a rugged landscape that literally held on to a massive secret for tens of thousands of years. We're going to look at the exact archaeological discovery that forced scientists to just completely rewrite the timeline of human settlement on the Australian continent. So, for most of the 20th century, the accepted model of how humans populated Australia was, well, pretty simple. The thought was that the first Australians arrived by sea in the north roughly 50,000 years ago and then essentially just hugged the coastlines for thousands of years. The interior, that vast, harsh red desert covering like 70% of Australia's landmass, was considered the ultimate last frontier. People just assumed it was way too hostile to survive in early on. And up until recently, the oldest known evidence of humans in Australia's arid zone was dated to about 38,000 years ago. So the interior was placed roughly 12,000 years behind the coastal settlements. But get this, we were off, way off, by exactly 11,000 years. Okay, let's really dive into this. The old belief, the coastal model, argued that early populations just lacked the resources and technology to push inland, right? Meaning the interior was settled 38,000 years ago at the earliest. But then, the Waridi site comes along and completely shatters this reality, definitively proving the interior was actually settled 49,000 years ago. This discovery literally dismantled the coastal model overnight. It showed us that early humans absolutely did not just wait around on the beaches. They moved deep into the continent almost immediately after arriving. Alright, Section 1, a discovery in the desert. To really understand how this monumental shift in our understanding happened, we need to go back to a very specific and, honestly, a surprisingly relatable moment in a remote, hyper-arid gorge. Picture this. The Flinders Ranges rising out of the flat plains about 500 kilometers north of Adelaide in South Australia. This rugged, just breathtaking landscape is the traditional territory of the Adnyamathanha people, which translates to the people of the Rocky Hills. And our key figures here are Giles Ham, a researcher, and Clifford Coulthard. Now, Coulthard was an Adnyamathanha guide who had been moving through these gorges since the 1970s. He knew exactly where the permanent springs were, where the rocks created shelter, and he just had this unmatched, deep connection to the land. So in 2012, Ham and Coulthard are out surveying, and the discovery of a lifetime happens in the most ordinary way possible. Coulthard steps out of the vehicle to take a quick bathroom break in the scrub, and he spots a fissure in a cliff face roughly 20 meters up above a creek bed. But it wasn't just any crack in the rock, it had a blackened roof, and to an expert like Coulthard, that soot was the ultimate tell. A blackened roof in a rock shelter meant fire, and not just some random wildfire, but repeated, sustained fires in a space that humans had deliberately chosen and returned to over a long period of time. They hiked 2 kilometers through some really difficult terrain to reach this natural alcove, which happened to sit precisely beside a permanent spring. The site would eventually be named Waridi. This is the Adnyamathanha word for emu, and the origin of that name is actually pretty hilarious. It was named after a very curious emu that just wandered right into the rock shelter during the first excavation season and flat out stole one of the archaeological team's sandwiches. But sandwiches aside, what they actually found buried in the floor of that shelter changed absolutely everything. 49,000. That is the number of years ago that humans first occupied this site. And scientists didn't just guess this number, right? They confirmed it using 2 independent, highly rigorous methods. They used radiocarbon dating on hearth charcoal and ancient emu eggshells, and then they backed that up with optically stimulated luminescence, which is this amazing technique that measures exactly when buried quartz grains were last exposed to sunlight. Both methods came back with the exact same consistent result: 49,000 years. The coastal model had just been measured against the ground, and the ground firmly disagreed. Moving right along to Section 2, artifacts in the ashes. The artifacts they pulled from the ground brilliantly illustrate just how incredibly dense with history the site was. Get this, between 2012 and 2014, the team excavated to a depth of just 1 single meter. Just one. And in that single meter of dirt, they found over 4,300 stone artifacts. They recovered 3 kilograms of animal bone from 17 different species. They found emu eggshells suggesting seasonal visits. They found red ochre and white gypsum pigments. And astonishingly, they found a sharpened bone point carved from a rock wallaby, which is officially the oldest directly dated bone tool ever found in Australia. They also found the absolute earliest evidence of hafted tools in Australia and Southeast Asia. Now, if you aren't familiar, a hafted tool is basically a composite implement. It's where a stone blade is glued, usually with resin, to a wooden handle, and this creates a cutting instrument with just way more force and precision than a simple handheld blade. Microscopic analysis at Waridi actually confirmed there was resin adhering to the blades, and since you have to deliberately collect resin from the surrounding landscape, it proves these early settlers weren't just barely surviving, they were highly sophisticated engineers of their environment. So because the team dug straight down, looking at this timeline is literally like reading a history book backwards. At the shallow depth, 38,000 to 40,000 years ago, we find that incredibly precise sharpened bone tool. In the mid-layers, we see white gypsum pigment that they had to transport from 12 to 15 kilometers away, likely for ceremonial body paint. And deep down, at 85 to 90 centimeters, dating back 46,000 to 49,000 years, they found red ochre, the earliest documented use of this pigment in the whole region. This setup tells such a profound story. It wasn't a permanent settlement, no, but it was a deliberate, intentional choice. People came back to this exact same gorge again and again across tens of thousands of years. Now, you might be wondering, why do they keep coming back here? Well, the magic word is refugia. During the last glacial maximum, temperatures dropped massively across central Australia and the plains became hyper-arid, basically completely unlivable. But these specific gorges, with their steep sheltered walls and permanent springs, acted as isolated habitats. They functioned as refugia. They were the only places within a vast radius where a sustained human presence was even possible. These early humans knew exactly how to adapt to extreme climate shifts by utilizing these geological lifelines. The researchers themselves put this perfectly when the findings were published in the journal Nature. Quote, "The location of Waridi implies a more direct north-south route for pioneering settlers rather than an exclusively coastal one." Unquote. Think about that. If people were already hundreds of kilometers inland within a few thousand years of arriving on the continent, they were moving fast. They were following river systems, tracking those permanent springs. The colonization of Australia was just incredibly adaptive and technically sophisticated from day one. Which brings us to Section 3, the megafauna overlap. For decades now, Australian paleontology has been wrestling with a massive mystery. Why did the continent's giant marsupials, enormous flightless birds, and massive predators suddenly disappear? We've got two fiercely debated theories here. First is the climate theory, which is the idea that progressive aridification and expanding deserts simply reduce the landscape's ability to support these huge animals. Second is the human theory, the idea that sustained, low-level hunting pressure applied over thousands of years to animal populations that had absolutely no behavioral adaptations to avoid human predators caused the collapse. Now, Waridi doesn't completely end the extinction debate, but it acts as a very strict constraint, a fixed point in the historical record. Let's look at the timeline. We know humans arrived around 50,000 years ago. Thanks to Waridi, we now have rock-solid proof of occupation between 49,000 and 46,000 years ago, deep in the interior. Data from ocean sediment cores shows that herbivore biomass started to decline 45,000 years ago, culminating in an extinction collapse by 43,100 years ago. So Waridi gives us the earliest fixed point, proving that humans and megafauna definitively coexisted in the exact same region for thousands of years before the animals vanished. Finally, Section 4, Rewriting Human History. Excavation actually paused in 2014, mostly due to the intense logistics of reaching such a remote site and, of course, funding cycles. But in 2021, a huge $910,000 Australian Research Council grant was awarded to a team led by Giles Ham and the traditional owners, and their methodology going forward is revolutionary. They are actively braiding standard archaeological Western science with deep Adnyamathanha indigenous knowledge. Plus, a UNESCO World Heritage nomination for the region is going to be officially lodged in 2026, which recognizes not just the deep geological history, but the living, continuing relationship the Adnyamathanha people have with this landscape today. But here is the craziest part to me. During that first excavation, the team only dug down 1 meter. Just 1 meter of depth completely rewrote the timeline for interior settlement and technological development in Australia. But when they probed the floor of their trench, they realized something staggering. They hadn't hit bedrock yet. The sediment continues further down. The record isn't complete. So it really makes you wonder, if the very first meter rewrote 50,000 years of history, what older secrets are still waiting in the dirt below? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this sparks your curiosity to keep following the incredible discoveries that are sure to come out of Waridi.